we're in a situation where I think you can define it best by considering that there are now really only two options. One option is to basically negotiate an end to this thing in which there'll be compromises on both sides so that each of the adversary parties here, the United States and Iran, can domestically claim victory.
Well, welcome back to the Heroes Path podcast. I'm Colonel John Fenzel. Last week, Jeff Steinberg and I walked you through the dual blockade, the United States and Iran simultaneously choking each other's shipping. We told you that oil hit $126 a barrel intraday on April 29th. We told you that on May 1st, that was the war powers deadline. The Senate was in recess and the administration was arguing that a ceasefire pauses the 60-day clock. We told you about 3 days that you needed to watch, May 11th, May 12th, and May 14th. Well, this week, all three are now 72 hours away. And in the days between our last conversation and today, the situation has moved again further and faster than the week before. So let's just review the bidding. On Tuesday, Secretary of State Rubio stood at a White House lectern and declared that Operation Epic Fury, the air and naval campaign that began on February 28th, quote, concluded. The same day, the U.S. tried to escort commercial ships through the Straits of Hormuz and turned around. And then on Wednesday, Axios reported the two sides are closing in on a 1-page, 14-page memorandum of understanding. And then on Thursday, the U.S. and Iranian forces exchanged fires in the Strait. So Trump called it just a love tap. On Friday, the U.S. disabled 2 Iranian oil tankers. Iran attacked the UAE, and Secretary of State Rubio said that he was waiting for a, quote, serious offer from Tehran by the end of business. Well, we heard this week that war is concluded, the shooting continues, the deal is close, the ceasefire is holding. These things are all being said simultaneously by the same administration. So it's like the right hand isn't talking to the far right hand. So Jeff Steinberg's been with us every week. Nobody better to tell us about what all of this means and what is actually true. Jeff, thanks very much for being back with us.
I'm going to be here, John, and you're absolutely right. Things are moving at breakneck speed, and sometimes the same mouths are saying things that come out of the opposite side and seem to be completely contradictory. But I think there's some essential things that happened since our last discussion that really redefined the parameters of this whole war situation. Trump, while announcing that the main military campaign that was launched on February 28th is now concluded, almost immediately afterwards, announced that the U.S., as you said, was going to be escorting ships through the Straits of Hormuz. 2 ships got through. U.S. ships were turned back, but almost within 48 hours of starting this next stage, President Trump made a really critical announcement, namely that he was calling off Operation Freedom at the behest of the Prime Minister of Pakistan and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Now, the inclusion of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in this announcement coincided with both Saudi Arabia and Kuwait telling the United States that the U.S. did not have permission to launch this Operation Freedom escort and presumably the attacks against Iranian ships and others intercepting the transit through the straits from Saudi and Kuwaiti soil. So in other words, some of the most powerful, perhaps the most powerful regional player, Saudi Arabia, in the form of the Crown Prince, who everybody knows is running the show there, basically pulled the plug on the U.S. operation and indicated that regional forces are aligning more with the demand that this whole operation be resolved in some kind of diplomatic final agreement. Now, you mentioned the 14.1-page proposal that seems to have been initiated in Washington and contains a number of demands that are quite clearly not acceptable to Iran. But Pakistan, with the endorsement of Saudi Arabia, China, and others, presented a very simple framework proposal, three elements to it. Number one, that the blockade ends and the blockading of the Straits of Hormuz ends and basically the war is over. Number two, that there will be a diplomatic process that, at least initially, will take place over a 30-day period, hammering out all of the details. And number three, that the issue of Iran stockpile of the 60% enriched uranium will be dealt with in some fashion in which it will no longer be 60% enriched in the possession of Iran. It may be turned over to the Russians, maybe to the US, maybe it'll be watered down to a much lower level of intensity. But bottom line is that 3-point agreement is something that both sides can walk away and claim some margin of victory. And so it remains to be seen whether that will be accepted or not.
It's interesting, Jeff, because Trump on Thursday said they've agreed, but then Iranian media immediately said no, that they haven't finalized their response. And then Rubio said that they were just waiting for a serious offer from Iran by the end of business, as I mentioned earlier. But those two statements, Trump's, they agreed, and then Rubio's send me a serious offer, all those are within 48 hours apart. So what does that mean when you reflect on the actual state of the talks?
Sides are addressing internal audiences, which is a really critical issue, both for Trump because of the upcoming November elections, among other things, and for the Iranians because there are clearly different points of view within this current leadership strata. It's a much more opaque process than the sort of rough and tumble politics of Washington and the United States. President Pezeshkian said that he had met in person last week with the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. And so there are clearly elements on the Iranian side that want this deal and other elements, particularly centered around this core group of 5 leaders of the IRGC, who are more skeptical about it and have maybe a different perspective. And so I think we're in a situation where I think you can define it best by considering that there are now really only 2 options. One option is to basically negotiate an end to this thing in which there'll be compromises on both sides so that each of the adversary parties here, the United States and Iran, can domestically claim victory. Israel is the wild card factor, both in terms of the politics in Washington. I think it's noteworthy that a virtual Israeli agent, a guy named Nick Stewart, was recently appointed at the initiative of Jared Kushner to be Steve Witkoff's deputy in the negotiations. Stewart has been the chief Capitol Hill lobbyist for the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, which was created explicitly as an arm of the Israeli government in the United States back in 2001. The head of strategic communications for the Israeli government, an Air Force general at the time, acknowledged that the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, which was originally named a Hebrew word that means truth, is working in coordination with her office. And there's a list of 5 top, quote, retired Israeli generals who are listed actively as fellows at the FDD. So Nick Stewart, who was the chief Capitol Hill lobbyist for this group, is now inserted into the negotiating team. So on both sides, you've got elements that are really looking to sabotage the negotiations because the only alternative to negotiations is a full-blown U.S. drive with Israel for regime change in Tehran. There's very little that stands in the middle between a temporary agreement that brings an end to this war, but really doesn't leave anything ultimately resolved, versus what the Israelis want. And they clearly have multiple ways in which they can be a wrecking ball. They're pressure in Washington. They can stage an incident which basically fuels the hardline faction in Tehran to take aggressive counteraction, and we're off to the races again. So I think that really defines the boundary conditions on both sides for where we are at this moment.
Yeah. Well, it seems when you look at what Secretary of State Rubio is confronting, he's got the gap between the war's stated objectives and then what is the likely outcome. The U.S. went to war back in February, partly to keep the strait open, but then here we are 70 days later, and Iran has institutionalized this toll system. They've actually formalized a transit authority for the straits. And now we talked about this MOU that's being negotiated that defers the Hormuz question to a 30-day negotiating period. And it's not going to be just 30 days. I mean, it's going to be much longer than that.
Right.
But they haven't conceded any sovereignty. So Rubio's question is genuine. What enforcement mechanism exists after this deal is signed? So there's a lot still to be worked out. How do you interpret that?
Until this point, with the exception of that first Islamabad meeting that Vice President Vance led, where there were American experts who got some knowledge base in the intricacies of navigation, of the nuclear issue, all of those things. The Iranians have been sending a bunch of people with PhDs who have both diplomatic and scientific and engineering credentials. And the U.S. is yet to put together a team of more than just family members and golf buddies. And now, of course, as I said, we've got Nick Stewart added to the mix, who's really there representing Israeli interests far more than American.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work that definitely needs to be done. But I think that President Trump and the Iranians, at least factions within Tehran, want to bring this thing to an end. It's caused significant damage in both instances. The Iranians still have a pretty impressive missile and drone capability left intact, but they've suffered significantly. And if anything, the blockade has caused substantial hardship. And on the Trump side,
I read that there is a CIA document that said that they could absorb this blockade for another 4 to 5 months.
Correct. And there's another agency, NIC, National Intelligence Council assessment, that they've been able to reconstitute and retain between the two about 70% of their missile and drone capability.
Yeah. Let's look now domestically, because we talked about this next 72 hours. And so if you go through what's going to happen in the next 72 hours, first, the Senate reconvenes on Monday. Senator Murkowski's been drafting an authorization for the use of military force. Where does that stand right now?
Both the House and the Senate, the Democrats in the House have announced that they're preparing a war powers resolution as well. Yeah. And a number of members of Congress, both the House and the Senate, in both parties, had said that basically they were giving President Trump his 60 days. But clearly we're 10 days past that now. And so I think there's a different mood in Capitol Hill. And remember, when members of Congress go home for recesses, they are hearing from their constituents. And if any of the polling data is to be believed, the overwhelming view, the sentiment among the American people, American voters, is that they didn't approve of this war and they want it over. The gas prices and many other factors are obviously contributing.
Yeah.
So if there's an election factor that plays into this, and clearly there is, then that's got to be driving Trump in the direction of saying, let's bring this thing to an end in a way that we can spin it, that we somehow or other achieved most, if not all, of our goals.
Well, because the next date that we're going to be looking at is Tuesday, May 12th, and that's when the April CPI drops, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And also, I think it's important to note that the three of the largest U.S. oil companies issued a joint assessment last week on Friday that the strategic reserves and the oil tankers that were already outside the Straits of Hormuz have been depleted. And the longer this goes on, the more significant spikes you're going to see, both in oil prices and, of course, in the next few months, we'll be seeing the consequences of the loss of fertilizer for the spring plantings around the world.
And then we have the third date, which is May 14th and 15th. That's when Trump sits down with
Xi Jinping.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about that.
Again, I think that Trump really is looking to strike a deal with Xi that basically stabilizes, at least on the surface, the U.S.-China trade and economic relationship. The all of the rhetoric that you hear from various administrations and various personalities is offset by the fact that U.S.-China trade continues to increase. And so I think that both sides realize there's a kind of an economic equivalent of mutual assured destruction if there's a full-blown falling out between the U.S. and China. And so Trump needs that. And I think that the Chinese are prepared to extract a price to move forward on those economic ties. And of course, the Chinese are smelling like the honest brokers around the Middle East situation because Pakistan has been functioning as a kind of a proxy for Beijing in trying to mediate and bring this to an end. And now you've got the Saudis. Remember, back a number of years ago, Xi Jinping hosted a meeting between the Iranians and the Saudis that sort of brought stability, a little element of normalization to relations within the Gulf. So the Chinese have that profile of being the sort of actual honest brokers. The United States and Israel started this war, so the United States in no way can credibly play any role as a mediator in any of this.
Right. I'll never forget. Was in Islamabad, Pakistan. I woke up and our hotel was the Marriott there in Islamabad. I went down for breakfast, and sitting right next to me was China's chief of staff of their army. So their relationship goes back a long ways, and
Absolutely
you're exactly
does.
right. So, Jeff, quickly, what would you say are the three things that our listeners ought to be watching here in the next week? And we're going to do this again next week if we possibly can as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, look, I think you really pointed to three of the critical issues that are going to be visible in the media this coming week. Number one, Congress back in session. What actions are taken around AUMF and war powers? Number two, as you said, the economic data, consumer price index coming out. It's very clear that there will be a significant spike in inflation, which translates into the fact that interest rates are not going to come down. And Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, made clear that Treasury is going to be issuing an increasingly larger volume of treasuries, and in other words, increasing the debt, and that those are going to be under 1 year in duration for the most part. So they're going into the short-term borrowing markets at these higher interest rates. The third thing, obviously, is Trump in China. Yeah. But again, I would also urge, don't take your eye off the ball in terms of the dynamic changes underway among the Gulf Arab states that had been historically viewed as proxies and assets of the United States. And they're now taking some pretty bold and decisive steps to declare their independence from that. And Saudi Arabia leading the charge is really a stunning and extremely important development.
And last week, we said that the war's effects are sitting in your mortgage rate and your grocery bill. You mentioned the April CPI numbers that are going to be coming out on May 12th. So that's still true. But I think here's some other things to think about. This ceasefire isn't a pause. I would probably classify it as something else, certainly not an endpoint. What's being constructed in Islamabad and, as you mentioned, Jeff, in Beijing is a framework for a much longer negotiation during which both sides are going to continue to use economic and military pressure to shape the outcome. So this isn't just a military deal. There's lots of other dimensions to this: diplomatic, informational, economic, and a lot of other things that fit into it as well. This 30-day negotiation is easily going to become 60 days and then 90 days. And then the questions that were unresolved back when this started in February, I think the end of February 28th was when all this started. Enrichment, the Straits of Hormuz, proxy sanctions are still going to be unresolved when that negotiation period closes. So this is a wide open issue without question. And meanwhile, we talked a little bit about this, Jeff, before we went on air. It's clear that President Trump is trapped between two outcomes in the Iran conflict. You have the escalation that he likely doesn't want, and then a negotiated settlement that risks him looking weak after months of very tough rhetoric. So it's clear that the administration has entered this war believing that economic pressure and the Israeli strikes and the U.S. military leverage, that all that would lead to a quick capitulation. But that has not happened at all. And and as you had just mentioned, Jeff, it's apparent that President Trump now is looking for an off-ramp more than a victory parade through that victory arch that he's planning over Memorial Drive. So
Exactly. Yeah.
there's a lot of things that are still at play. And ultimately, I think all of this is, if you look at it, it fits right into that whole rubric of what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. This is the poly crisis. This is it by definition.
And I think another framework to think about is the fake peace that existed between the end of World War I and the outbreak of World War II.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Everybody keeps talking about this war like it arrived from another planet, that this is something that's incredibly unique. Well, it didn't, and it's not unique. The names change, the missiles get faster, the ranges get further, the maps get cleaner on television, but the basic machinery is as old as the Peloponnesian War. And what I'd love to do, Jeff, next week is talk about some of those parallels, because there's lots of them. It's not only, by the way, the Suez crisis either. That was one parallel we talked about, but there's so many others. So maybe next week we can talk about some of those different parallels.
Sure. One of my favorite chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, was asked what keeps him awake at night. And he said, it's all about China, and it's all about avoiding the Thucydides trap, meaning that an emerging power versus a static power very often leads to war.
Yeah. And you could argue that the United States is Athens right now. We'll talk about that next week, but and we'll stop there because we said that we were going to make this short. Jeff Steinberg, thanks very much. You've been right every single week, and we're going to have you back next week to talk more about this. To our listeners, stay informed, stay grounded, and seek out clarity above all else, because there's lots of noise out there in the midst of all this. I'm Colonel John Fenzel. Thanks very much for listening to the Heroes Path podcast. We'll see you next week.